Hello and welcome back to my channel. Now, what's the most expensive DVD or Blu-ray purchase I've ever made? Well, actually, there's no contest. It is this gigantic beast, this tombstone of a box set. This is Criterion's collection of Ingmar Bergman, an almost complete collection of his major films. And suitably for Ingmar Bergman, buying it for quite a lot of money from the States was an act of faith for me. The reason is because I hadn't watched Bergman for many years. I first discovered him in my 20s. Well, strictly speaking, actually, in my teens when I watched The Seventh Seal, but we'll come to that in a moment. But I watched the vast majority of his films in my 20s, and I was really struck by a filmmaker who never seemed to be the same twice, who was restlessly experimental, and who, for me, his penetrating insight into the psychology between men and women had never been equalled, at least up until that point, but I still don't think it has actually. I think he is the great director of the relationship between man and woman. But as I got into film, I discovered that many people didn't like Bergman and that he trailed this reputation of being overrated. Even one of my favourite film critics, Jonathan Rosenbaum, took out an article in the New York Times when he died to say how overrated he was, which I thought was a bit mean-spirited, and I disagreed with it very strongly. But I thought, after all these years I haven't watched Bergman, what would I make of it now? Well, when I got this box set and I started watching through it, I needn't have worried. I liked his films even more. Let's talk a little bit about, before we go into the top 10, let's talk a little bit about why did people think Bergman was overrated? And why I think this is a particularly American phenomenon. And why what people say about him is overrated actually shows why I like him so much. I think, first of all, there are three main reasons. First of all, Bergman was a victim of history. Now, Bergman came to prominence in the 1950s, and that was when world cinema, art cinema, was first coming to prominence. And there were three big names that even people who weren't really cinephiles were familiar with. They were Bergman, Fellini, and Kurosawa. And they were kind of like cinematic art, right? But then just when, Bergman had won this label and was one of the major filmmakers of the world, along came the French Nouvelle Vague, a new kind of cinema, young and free-spirited, filmed on the hoof in the streets in Paris, with a whole new attitude towards cinematic history, where, for example, they resurrected Hollywood cinema, the cinema of Hitchcock and Ford and Hawks, as being great cinematic art. And suddenly there was a sort of youth and counterculture, swing in place in cinema. And suddenly Bergman looked old and boring. It looked like art with a capital A, fusty old art, So Bergman was a victim of this, and the American critics particularly, who took on this French criticism and started looking at their own American cinema in a very different way. This was the new cinema, this was the new attitude towards cinema, and Bergman stood in the way. He was an obstacle. This was the capital A, old-style way of looking at art, and it was an obstacle. So I think a lot of critics at that time, from Andrew Sarris, Paul Hinckhale, Jonathan Rosenbaum, rejected Bergman for that reason. Secondly, Bergman's interests. Bergman was primarily interested in interior ideas, things that had been part of art for centuries, ideas about love and desire, sexual psychology, faith. Is there a God? Isn't there a God? What do we do if there isn't a God? All these kind of questions. The Nouvelle Vague kind of blasted this out of the scene, and suddenly there was a new interest in youth, in politics, in counterculture, and suddenly Bergman found himself again travelling in the wrong direction. If you read his detractors, you will read a lot about the fact that he was really a theatre director, and in fact most of his life was devoted to theatre. He usually only made films in the summer, but most of the time he was a director of the National Theatre in Malmö or Stockholm. And it's true that he was a director of theatre, to which my answer is, so what? Why can't a director use cinema as a means of experiments in theatre? Why is that uncinematic? I think one of the extraordinary things about Bergman's work is that I think it is an experimentation in theatre, on film. And that changes both our attitudes both to theatre and film at the same time. You see, I think Bergman's great project as a director is he's investigating the nature of our relationship with the actor. That to me is the heart of Bergman's cinema. So what he's doing is he's coming out of the theatre, which was his life and his primary love. And he's saying, but now we take the actor into the cinema, where, in the theatre you're far away and the actor dominates and controls. Now in cinema we can go up close, personal, right? We're in a much more intimate space with the actor. But what does that mean? How do we negotiate it? How does that work on cinema? That's Bergman's primary interest, and he never stops experimenting with that throughout his cinema, as we're going to see in this top 10. And I think a lot of his detractors haven't picked up on that. No other director of that era so experimented with the audience's relationship with the actor. Let's get on with the top 10 then, and let's go back to the beginning of Bergman's career and his first truly great film in my estimation, Summer with Monica, that he made in 1951. A very simple, classic film in terms of its narrative. Boy meets girl, they fall in love, they go off on holiday to this archipelago of islands south of Stockholm, and they try to have an idyllic summer together, but the course of true love doesn't run quite smooth. And the reason is because the girl in question is very willful and capricious and a bit of a wild child. And the heart of this film is the discovery of the actress Harriet Anderson, a magnificently sexy and fresh and new actress. And really it's her performance that this film is all about. And her performance to me represents a kind of springtime for cinema. We've gone through the horrors, the winter of the Second World War, we're coming out of it, and suddenly youth bursts forth, and a new youthful attitude bursts forth in the figure of Harriet Anderson. And this is encapsulated in one very famous shot. And here we go back to what I was talking about, Bergman's relationship with actors. At one stage towards the end of the narrative, she runs out on her young husband and her child. She goes down to a bar, she starts flirting with the men in the bar and drinking. The camera is now side on to her, she's in profile, right? And she turns and looks straight down the camera lens. A completely impassive face, daring us to disagree with her, daring us to judge her. It is an extraordinary moment in film history, one of the great epiphanies of film history, I think. The American critic and filmmaker Tom Anderson credited Godard with rediscovering the face as the primary factor in cinematic language. I think he was wrong. It was Bergman with Harriet Anderson who rediscovered the face as the primary factor in that one remarkable shot. And so encapsulated in that shot in Harriet Anderson's performance is this new bloom of youth, of counterculture, of free spirit after this winter of the Second World War. And that's why I think Summer with Monica is a really great and underrated film. My ninth film couldn't be more different, really. This is a film where Harriet Anderson is slowly dying for most of the film. It's Cries and Whispers. It's all set in one house, a kind of Kammerspiele, a kind of chamber drama. And as she's dying, her two sisters look back on their lives. It's a very grim film, lots of wailing and moaning and painful sighs. I think Truffaut was right when he said that the reason why audiences flocked to this film and made it a big success was because of the red walls of the house in which it's set, giving a sort of warm, womb-like feel to the film which people responded to, because it's actually an extraordinarily grim film, which I rejected on first viewing, but seeing it again I thought was extraordinary, particularly the performances of Liv Ullmann and Ingrid Thulin, who are probably my two favourite Bergman actresses. Thulin's performance is incredibly tough and strong, and Bergman goes into really dark territory with self-harm and all sorts of... There's an extraordinary scene where Liv Ullmann's lover documents all the things that are showing age in her face. It's really cruel. It's tough filmmaking, but it's brilliant filmmaking, and it's a film that I think everyone should wrestle with at some point. In eighth place is Winter Light. This was the film that I fell most in love with in my 20s, and it's a day in the life of a country priest who is losing his faith. One of his parishioners, played by Max von Sydow, commits suicide because he can't take the depression of the world around him. What really struck me about this film was twofold. First of all, those people who say that Bergman didn't care about cinema and didn't experiment in cinema, talking out their bums, really. He and Sven Nykvist, the cinematographer, spent hours in local churches plotting the course of the light through the day and experimenting with how to film that light. So that's one thing that's interesting about the film. But the thing that really struck me as a 20-year-old was a sequence where a woman parishioner who's fallen in love with this priest writes a letter to him. And again, going back to what I was saying about Bergman experimenting with actors, the letter is read to camera by Ingrid Thulin, the actress. So she's staring us full in the face, disclosing her most intimate feelings. It's very powerful. And then Gunnar Bjornstrand, the priest, will speak back to her with extraordinary, intimate honesty about his dislike of her and the way she annoys him and the things about her that he dislikes. A kind of open transparency between a man and a woman which I'd never seen in a film before and which is so powerful that you almost cringed, you were almost wincing, you know. And that's the scene that really stayed with me. There are other Bergman films that have come forward since seeing Winter's Light, but I still think it's a great film. And very, well worth watching. The performances by Bjornstrand and Ingrid Thulin are extraordinary. In seventh place is a very underrated Bergman film, Shame. Now, Bergman made a trilogy of films in the late 60s, and this was where he was getting the most criticism in his career, and the Americans were turning against him. And he was having a bit of a dark night of the soul. I mean, Bergman was always having a dark night of the soul, but this was particularly bad. And by this time, he'd retreated to his island of Furö. It's spelled F-A-R-O, it's pronounced Furö, I believe. Again, off the south coast of Sweden, a very remote little island, and this is where he made his home for most of his life. And he made a trilogy of films, all filmed on Furö. One was called Hour of the Wolf, which nearly made this list, which is as close as Bergman gets to a horror film. It's very surreal and weird. It has people walking on ceilings and vampires, almost. It's a very strange film. There's one incredible sequence, one of the best sequences Bergman ever filmed, where he's fishing with this boy, and he sort of pushes the boy into the lake and drowns him. It's a very, very strange sequence, very unsettling. Anyway, the second and third films in this trilogy are both on my list, and I really value these films a lot. Shame, my seventh film, is an extremely underrated film. It's a more straightforward film than Bergman usually made. It's simply about a middle-class couple, who are living through a war. It's suggested a civil war in there, and it shows how this war and the violence of it impacts on their lives and their psychology, and how slowly their marriage starts to fall apart. And the woman almost feels uncomfortably is forced into an affair with a local mayor in order to buy them good grace with the local authorities. The performances by Max von Sydow and Liv Ullmann are incredible, and I think this is one of the great war films. It's one of the great anti-war films in the way it shows how war affects ordinary people in civilian life. There are not that many great films on that subject if you think about it. This is one of the best, but it gets ignored because it's a Bergman film, so it's put in the art house category instead of in the sort of anti-war category, but it's actually one of the really most powerful films on that subject. My sixth place is a more conventional Bergman classic, Wild Strawberries. This is about a professor who travels across country to receive an award, and as he travels across country in the company of his daughter-in-law, he starts to look back on his life and look at his failings and his flaws. When I first saw this film in my 20s, I wasn't a great fan. When I saw it again a couple of years ago, I fell in love with it because, of course, this is a film about aging, right? It's about becoming old and looking back on your life, and now I'm unfortunately in that position where I probably have more life behind me than ahead of me. I hope so, anyway. So I'm closer to the age of the professor in the film, who incidentally was played by Victor Seastrom, one of Bergman's mentors and a hugely important figure in the early part of Swedish cinema. I really love this film, actually, now. I adore it. It's very well written. It's very well acted. Ingrid Thulin again is brilliant and incredibly beautiful in it. Um, and I think what also I like about this film, it's often said that Bergman is a misery guts and a depressive. He was quite a miserable guy, but it's not true that there isn't happiness and light in his films. And people forget that Wild Strawberries ends really beautifully and movingly, with the old man having a vision, a dream vision of his parents at peace. And it's a very moving film. It believes in humanity, it believes in people, and it believes in hope. Watch it again if you think that Bergman is a misery guts. You'll be surprised. In fifth place, where I came in, I was 18 years of age. I saw on BBC Two they were going to show The Seventh Seal. I'd heard it was a very important film. My parents had gone to bed. I had the living room to myself, poured myself a nice Coke and had some chocolates, and I sat down to watch The Seventh Seal. It blew my mind. The first foreign language art house film I ever watched of my own volition. I had no conception that such a film existed, that you could have this kind of medieval morality play done as a modern film. I thought it was extraordinary, and I was really pleased when I went back and watched it again a few years ago. It stands up. You know, so many people like to knock down The Seventh Seal, and it's been taken the piss out of so many times. You know, Bill and Ted's Extraordinary Journey and so on. But you know what? It still stands up, and it's still powerful, and it's still moving. I still find the vision of them going up the hill, all chained together, sort of linked together in their arms, still incredibly powerful. Um, and again, those people who say that there is no beauty in Bergman, there's no lightness, the scene where they eat strawberries and cream, strawberries and milk, and look up into the sunshine all together, you know, the fool and his family, and the knight and his squire, that scene is so beautiful. It's so moving. It's a great film, Seventh Seal. If you've never seen it, do watch it. It's superb. Now, in fourth place, I'm going to pick a film that I think is the secret best film Ingmar Bergman ever made, which is a bit odd, seeing as I've got three others to pick. But what I mean is, this is a film that often gets overlooked. It's never regarded as one of Bergman's great films, yet all that's great in Bergman is in this movie. It's called The Passion of Anna. It's the third of the Furor trilogy, and it's a very strange film indeed. It's about a growing relationship between Max von Sydow and Liv Ullmann again. Liv Ullmann has lost her daughter and her husband in a car crash under rather mysterious circumstances. Max von Sydow is a loner, a rather passive-aggressive man. And all the while that their relationship is burgeoning, someone is going around the countryside killing sheep. That doesn't really get to the heart of what makes this film so uniquely disturbing and surprising. Brilliantly filmed in colour. Again, throughout, Bergman starts experimenting with how we relate to the actors and the characters. So he will introduce them in little short snippets of information. So he does away with characterization and exposition, he just voices it. And then all the way through the film, the actors have little snippets where they're interviewed as themselves, talking about the roles they're playing. It's a kind of chaotic film, but if that makes it sound very sort of arty and sort of nouveau vague, the end result is not like that at all. It's a very powerful and very disturbing film. I think it's at one and the same time Bergman's most experimental and the film that has the most fullest emotional impact and psychological impact. And I think it often gets overlooked. Do try it, it's extraordinary. Third place, Scenes from a Marriage. I do not want to talk about the remake, all right? I just want to talk about the 1975 original. And if you're going to watch this film, the movie cut down is very good, but please, please watch the full TV original. It is extraordinary. The performances by Liv Ullmann and Erland Josephson are two of the greatest performances ever captured on camera. They're just absolutely incredible. There is one episode where their marriage, it's a middle-class marriage, and how it breaks down. And there's one episode where it's all set in an office, which is obviously a set. You know, Bergman doesn't even try and hide it. And Liv Ullmann, she comes along with faux, levity, and says, "I want to have a divorce. Let's sign the papers. Let's have a bit of fun. Let's have a bit of sex. And end it on a high note." But Josephson breaks, and starts hitting her and using violence against her. The performance by the two actors, I mean, it's absolutely astonishing. I've never seen anything like it. I have not watched the Netflix series. I don't intend to. I don't see how any actors could ever match it. The 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 tension between Josephson and Ullman is absolutely incredible. I still think it's one of the best portraits of marriage and the complexity of a relationship between a man and a woman that you'll ever see on cinema or television. In second place, I had to put Persona. Persona is the one Ingmar Bergman film that I've noticed that even Ingmar Bergman detractors recognise as a masterpiece. You've got to love this movie. It's short, sharp, lean, and it cuts like a scalpel. It is an incredible movie. And really, in this movie, if I was going to be a bit naughty, I would suggest that Bergman took the ideas of the Nouvelle Vague, played with them, and then let them go. He did it all in one movie. He didn't need to go back, and that shows what a master he is. Persona is an extraordinary film. Liv Ullmann plays an actress who has had some kind of nervous breakdown or retreat into herself, and she stopped speaking. And she's put in the care of this nurse, brilliantly played by B.B. Anderson, her best performance ever, I think. And they put in this little seaside chalet together for this actress to recuperate, and their relationship builds. Their relationship builds through some of the most extraordinary scenes on film. In one long monologue sequence, B.B. Anderson tells Liv Ullmann of this kind of orgy experience she had with two men on a beach. It's brilliantly done by Anderson. Then the next day, she's taking a letter from Liv Ullmann's actress into town. She opens the letter and reads it, and she reads how Liv Ullmann takes the piss out of her and laughs at this extraordinary emotional confession. Then you'll see this scene where B.B. Anderson is watching like a cat as Liv Ullmann is walking around this courtyard, and she knows that there's a piece of glass. And then Liv Ullmann steps on it. She sees B.B. Anderson's, hatred in her eyes, and then the film breaks, and it seems to burn in the gate, and you get all these strange imageries that you've seen at the start of the film. This film just, it's so incredible. It's so powerful. There's one extraordinary scene where Liv Ullmann's lover, played by Gunnar Braunstrand again, who is blind, comes to visit her and mistakes B.B. Anderson for Liv Ullmann. And B.B. Anderson is almost screaming like, what are you doing? He doesn't realise it's me, but the love scene carries on with B.B. Anderson taking Liv Ullmann's place as these two women's personalities seem to merge together. So much of Persona has been copied since, so much of it might seem a bit old hat now, but I still think it's a film that has an extraordinary power. The opening sequence, which is a series of weird images, we see it's how a camera operates, how the light starts and fuses together, and then suddenly there's a whirl of filmic images, including an erect penis in the uncensored version. And this is how the film takes us in, and then we see a little boy holding up a hand to the image, the sort of fuzzy image of his own mother. It's extraordinary. Persona is a film that I think anyone who's in love with film, it's going to be right there, whether you like Bergman or not. It's incredible. But there's still one more film that I want to discuss, and that is Fanny and Alexander, which, among other things, is the summation of Bergman's work and is also the greatest Christmas movie ever made. Fanny and Alexander, a lot of people talk about how this film is like a great big novel, and it never is it? It never has the fullness of a novel, does it? The full TV version of Fanny and Alexander is one of the very few films in film history that does have the fullness and complexity and beauty of a novel. It's an extraordinary story. It's set in this theatrical Swedish family in the early 1900s, and the father dies. And the film concentrates on his two children, a young boy called Alexander and a young girl called Fanny. And their mother remarries, but she remarries a very strict sort of Christian minister who completely changes their lives. So the first part of the film, the Christmas part, is this extraordinary one-night party. So the actors have wrapped for Christmas, and they go back to the house and they have this magnificent party with loads of food and colour and candles and wine, and they're trying to flirt with the maids. It's so rich and vibrant. It's beautiful. It's the best Christmas film you'll ever see. And then they go into this cold, hard world of this, this minister. And the children are treated with strictness and severity. And then they escape. And this is where Bergman shows that he was a very brave filmmaker. They escape by a kind of miracle. The local Jewish businessman is a sort of lover of their grandmother, and he contrives to whisk them away from the house. And they go into his house, and it's a sort of world of wonders, a world of toys and puppets and theatre. And the businessman's son, one of his sons, who is clearly played by a woman, is this sort of weird kind of seer, kind of prophet. It's Bergman's fantastic celebration of theatre, of make-believe, of fiction. It's kind of Bergman coming to terms with himself, stopping worrying about God and society and the death of civilization, and just revelling in the things that he loves. Sex and make-believe, theatre, film, light shows, all those wonderful things. And the film ends with a wonderful scene where they're all gathered together, like in a Shakespearean comedy, with people getting married around a huge table. And he gives the final speech to this silly, frivolous brother, not the serious brother, but the silly, frivolous brother. And this is a wonderful moment for those of us who love Bergman, because he's finally coming to terms with himself, and the hopeful Bergman comes out. I should just mention before I leave that the first scene that Bergman wrote for this film, one of the most beautiful and limpid scenes he ever wrote, was this gorgeous scene where the grandmother, simply with her stepdaughter, daughter-in-law rather, just looks through some old family albums, and outside the summer rain on the window. Such a gorgeous scene. It's a beautiful film. It's such a rich film. Please, if you do watch it, don't watch the theatrical version, which is good, but watch the full TV version. It's so rich. It does have the richness of a Dickensian novel. It really does. It's beautiful. Okay, that was a long video, but I do like talking about Ingmar Bergman, one of my favourite directors. If you've ever been sceptical about Bergman, please go back and try him again. I think you'll be surprised at how good he is. Thanks for watching, and if you like my content, please like and subscribe.